Okay, this is your lesson today for section 4.1 in geometry. Most of the stuff is just going to be review. We're going to start by classifying triangles. There are three ways to classify a triangle by its sides. You have scalene, isosceles, and equilateral. And four ways to classify it by its angles: obtuse, acute, right, and equiangular. If it's scalene, then no sides are congruent. If it's isosceles, two sides are congruent. And if it's equilateral, all sides are congruent. Equilateral, of course, coming from equi for equal, and lateral for side. If you throw a lateral pass in football, it's a side pass. Pass the sideline. So we're going to start by looking at some of these triangles. How can we classify them? The first one we have right here, there are two sides here that are congruent. So that is going to be an isosceles triangle. If you look at this triangle right here, we have no sides that are the same, so this is going to be scalene. This one right here, no sides are the same, so this is also scalene. If you look at this triangle right down here, all three sides are the same. And if all sides are the same, it's equilateral. And if we look at this one right here, this one, no sides are the same, so it is scalene. All right, now let's look at how to classify a triangle by its angles. First one we have here is if it's obtuse. Obviously, if there is one obtuse angle, it is going to be an obtuse triangle. If there are three acute angles, then it's an acute triangle. But it's got to have all three of them to be an acute triangle. And if it's a right triangle, it only has to be one right angle. And if it's equiangular, well, this meaning, of course, equal. Angular is in angles. So three congruent angles. And we'll find out here that if the three angles are congruent, they're all going to be 60 degrees. So if we continue classifying these triangles here, this one right here, well, this one's 35 degrees, this one's 90 degrees. That's acute, but it's got one right angle here, so it's going to be a right scalene triangle. This one down here, this one over here, it's got 40 degrees, that's 75 degrees. That actually is also going to be an acute angle, so this is going to be an acute scalene triangle. Down here, all three of these are 60, which means you can describe it as an acute equilateral, but what we're actually going to say is, since all three angles are congruent, we're going to call it equiangular and equilateral. Now we could say acute, but we want to use the best term possible. So we're really going to use equiangular. Going back to these triangles up here, this isosceles triangle, it's got one right angle in it. So it's going to be a right isosceles triangle. And this one down here, it's got an obtuse angle in it, so it's going to be obtuse scalene. Now, a couple other things just to go along with this, though. The parts of triangles. Well, if you have an isosceles triangle, it has two parts. It's got legs and a base. It actually also has something called base angles. It's got base angles. So if we look up here to this triangle right here, these two parts right here are the legs. They are congruent. The two legs are congruent on an isosceles triangle. And this will be right here, this part right here would be called the base. So you got the legs, the base, and this would be a base angle. This will also be a base angle. So those are the legs, that's the base. If you have a right triangle, the right triangle also has parts. It has a hypotenuse, and it also has legs. The hypotenuse is always across from the right angle. It's the longest side. So if you look up here, here's the right angle. This is the side opposite. So this is the hypotenuse. That would mean this is a leg and this is a leg. If we think about it in terms of Pythagorean theorem, A and B are both legs and C is always the hypotenuse. If we look at this one over here, since this is actually an isosceles and right triangle, it has both qualifications. It's going to have a hypotenuse and legs as well. Well, the legs are still the same here, and right across from it, the base is also called its hypotenuse. So that's how you can go about classifying the triangles by their sides and by their angles. All right, and the second part of today's lesson. In an isosceles triangle here, the base angles are congruent if and only if the legs are congruent. So we're going to look at a couple of these here, and we're going to solve for x and for y. We're going to do that here in just a moment. We got one more idea here too. The triangle sum theorem. In any triangle, ABC, or it could be DOG, it doesn't matter. If you add up all three angles, they're going to add up to 180. Now we'll prove this in the next section, but for right now, we're just getting used to the idea that there's 180 degrees if you add up all three angles inside of a triangle. So let's see how that's going to apply here. Well, in this triangle right here, I can see that these two base angles are congruent. The base angles are congruent, which means the two legs have to be congruent. Well, if these base angles are congruent, that means these two sides are congruent, which means on this one, x is going to be equal to 5. Now, using the triangle sum theorem, all three angles have to add up to 180 degrees. So we're going to take 70 plus angle y is equal to 180. So that's going to be 140 plus y is equal to 180. So that means y has to equal 40 degrees. Because 40 plus 140 is equal to 180. So y is going to be 40 degrees. Looking at this triangle up here, the two base angles are congruent, which means the two sides are going to be congruent. So in this one, x is going to equal 4. Base angles are congruent, so the sides are congruent. And sometimes if we have trouble here, we don't see that easily. Remember, you can always just rotate the paper until it looks like the base is on the bottom. Then it's a little bit easier to see, oh, that's 4, so that's got to be 4. The base angles are congruent, so the sides are congruent. Now the angle down here is 100 degrees. I'm going to turn this back. The angle down here is 100 degrees, so that means the two angles up here are going to have to add up to 80 degrees in order to make it 180. Because 100 plus, if that's y, that's also got to be y. You've got to add up to 180. If I subtract 100 from both sides, then y plus y is equal to 80, so we could do the algebra. We can just use some mental math here. What number plus itself gives us 80? Y's got to be 40 degrees. Y's got to be 40 degrees, right there. So both of those angles have to be 40. And then the last one right here. Once again, we got 3 and 3. The legs are congruent, so that means the base angles have to be congruent. These two angles have to be congruent. So once again, just to make things easier, I'm going to turn it on its side here. Since the legs are congruent, that means the base angles have to be congruent. So that means 80 plus, well, those have to be the same, so I could just call them both x if I want to. X plus x is equal to 180. So that means x plus x is going to have to be, if I subtract 80 from both sides, 100. So both of them have to be 50 degrees. I'm going to turn my paper back. This has got to be 50, x has to be 50, and y has to be 50 degrees. So the big idea here for today is if the base angles are congruent, then the legs are congruent. And if the legs are congruent, the base angles are congruent. And this only happens if it's an isosceles triangle.